name is Vivekanand Sondhi, and on behalf of the ML Sondhi Institute for Asia Pacific Affairs and Kalinga International Foundation, I welcome you all to today's webinar on military and strategic lessons from the Ukraine war. Today is the 135th day of the war, and this is our second webinar on the theme. The first webinar was held on May 17th, and further accumulation of developments and new facts being created on the battlefield in geopolitics and geoeconomics necessitates today's discussion. Whereas it's not central to the topic, I would like to pay my respects to the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He was the main architect of Quad and a friend of India. I'm happy to welcome Ambassador Lalit Mansingh, who will be chairing today's function and also soon be sharing his opening remarks. And I'm happy to have Professor Rosen and Ambassador Mohan Kumar join us again as panelists, and a special welcome to our third panelist, Admiral Menon. So I now hand over the proceedings to Ambassador Mansingh.
Well, thank you, Vivekanand. And let me start by thanking the ML Sondhi Foundation for organizing this webinar in collaboration with the Kalinga International Foundation. For me, this is a continuation of the earlier session which you mentioned, which was held on 28th May. Before I come to the subject, let me also pay my tribute to Shinzo Abe, one of the architects of the strategic partnership between India and Japan, and actually the man who talked about the Indo-Pacific during his talk at the Indian Parliament, where he referred to the meeting of the two oceans. And from then on, the concept has emerged and has now been accepted internationally. Well, today's session is, of course, a continuation of the earlier one in May, but many important global events have taken place since then. The G7 summit in Germany, the Quad summit in Tokyo, the BRICS summit hosted in Beijing, and the meeting of the G20 foreign ministers in Bali. Taking into account these intense global exchanges, we propose this evening to sharpen the focus on three major areas of interest to India. One, the lessons learned from Ukraine for a large power like India. Two, whether there is a need for a review of our military doctrines and force structures and weapons platforms in the light of the experience in Ukraine. And thirdly, has there been any impact of Ukraine on India's foreign policy and geopolitical approach? Well, we have assembled an impressive list of panelists. They have already been welcomed by Vivekananda. They are familiar names in the international think tank circuits, and I don't think there is any need to introduce them to this audience. Now, we have had this practice in our previous webinars of requesting our panelists to include in their narratives, if possible, some issues of particular interest to India. That being said, I wish to make it clear, there is absolutely no restriction on what the panelists wish to say on the subjects that are given to them. So let's set the ball rolling. We begin with Professor Rosen. Professor Rosen, in the webinar on 28th May, you had given a fascinating account of how Ukraine, with modest military resources, was able to resist the overwhelmingly superior forces of Russia. We are aware that many small countries like Moldova or Ukraine are drawing their own lessons and preparing for possible conflicts with bigger neighbors. So here are the issues that I think would be of particular interest to India. One, what would be the lessons which India can draw from the Ukraine conflict in terms of doctrines, force structures, and weaponry that we need to face an adversary, let's say, like China. And following from that, two other related issues. It would be wonderful if you could give a comparative assessment of the performance of Russian military equipment. You mentioned it briefly last time. Remember, this is a major component of the Indian military forces and the advanced weapons supplied to Ukraine by the West. And finally, a third point, you had already referred to Ukraine's superior cyber tactics. This is of immense interest to us. At least I don't know much about this area, but what would be interesting is to find out if Ukraine's experience will be useful for India, especially as Ukraine borrowed or received assistance from the advanced militaries of the West, but also from private operators in the United States and Europe. Now, extrapolating that experience with India, is it possible, in your view, to see if India's formidable private sector in IT and related domains can be equally effective in a possible confrontation with a bigger power? Now, Raja Menon, Raja, you and Professor Rosen are both disciples of Andrew Marshall, the guru of net assessment. So I will ask you to comment on Professor Rosen and tell us if you broadly agree with his assessments. The points I have for you are broadly similar to the ones I have mentioned. Specifically, what needs to change in the Indian military's force structure, choice of weaponry, and preparedness for cyber warfare. Secondly, India's military dependence on Russia has been a major element of our posture on Ukraine. Do you believe that a rapid diversification of India's military platform is called for? And if so, whether we can, as some experts have said, we can achieve this in as short a time as in the next 5 years. Number three, China has already been identified as the principal strategic threat to India. But China, as all experts point out, outmatches India in almost all the components of comprehensive national power. What would be your strategy for checkmating China in a future conflict situation? And finally, you have publicly expressed your misgivings about the Quad becoming a diplomatic grouping. I don't know what you have against diplomats, but this is a serious charge. And recent developments like AUKUS and the deliberations in the Quad summit make it clear that Quad's role as a security watchdog to checkmate China, an aggressive China in the Indo-Pacific, that role seems to have been seriously diluted. So the question I have for you is, are you still hopeful that the Quad can play a security role in the Indo-Pacific? Then I finally turn to Ambassador Mohan Kumar. Mohan, you'll be happy to know, I have deliberately reserved some of the most complex issues for you, with the confidence that with the vast diplomatic experience you have, you can come up with credible answers. Number one is, as I mentioned in my earlier, the impact, if any, on our foreign policy. Well, India faced a challenging task in defending its approach on Ukraine. It had to abstain 11 times on resolutions passed in the UN, and drew public criticism from its European and American allies. Of course, India's dexterous diplomacy, as our External Affairs Minister pointed out, succeeded in reassuring our partners and, in fact, in persuading them to accept and respect India's strategic autonomy. Now, there is, however, some nagging doubts as to whether we can rely on strategic autonomy as a doctrine that can help us in future conflict situations. And this is why this doubt is coming in my mind. Is there a likelihood that if India faces aggression in future, many of our partners may turn away from helping us? And if you remember, Russia and our non-aligned partners did so in 1962 in the India-China conflict, citing, of course, their own national interests. Okay. Secondly, do you believe that Russia is of diminishing strategic utility for India? And if so, how should India start decoupling from Russia? Number three, do you share Admiral Menon's misgivings about the Quad becoming a diplomatic grouping? And finally, at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting on the 16th of June, the External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, referred to geopolitical headwinds that are going to have a knock-on effects on food, energy, security, as well as logistics and supply chains. As an expert on geoeconomics, how do you think India can face these headwinds and yet be on track to become a $5 to $10 trillion economy? Well, these are some of the points that came to my mind, which you may like to refer. So without any further delay, let the discussions begin. Professor Rosen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me add my thanks to the ML Sondhi Foundation and to the members of the Sondhi family, who I regard as my close and longtime friends. I'd also thank the Ambassador for the challenging questions he posed to me with regard to my topic. To recapitulate, he has asked me to talk about the lessons for India of the Ukraine war with regard to force structure and doctrine. I will not comment on the implications for the Navy. Admiral Menon is far more qualified than I am to comment on that. He then asks me to comment on the observations about the relative strengths and weaknesses of Russian military equipment versus Western military equipment, and then finally talk about the issue of cyber conflict and the role of the private sector in fighting the cyber conflict in Ukraine and possible implications for India. With regard to the first topic, the lessons for force structure and doctrine, the last time we met, we were at the end of what was now called the first phase of the war, where Russia was trying to quickly seize the capital city of Kyiv and the other central parts of Ukraine. Let me talk about the lessons, quickly recapitulate the lessons from that phase of the war, and then turn to the lessons from the second phase of the war, which has transpired since the Russians shifted their attention to the eastern section of Ukraine, the so-called Donbass region. The lessons from the first phase of the war was that for the Ukrainians, the availability of American precision, tactical precision strike weapons, combined with intense training of small numbers of elite Ukrainian special forces, gave the Ukrainians the ability to strike Russian military mobile targets, tanks, logistics trains, trucks, and so forth, in a way which gave the Ukrainians a disproportionately large defensive capability and consistent with the predictions I made about a Ukraine war fought with precision weapons in 2016, the Ukrainians would be able to stalemate the Russians, and that is in fact what happened in the first phase of the war. This seemed to indicate the wisdom of focusing efforts on supplying relatively small numbers of precision weapons to a relatively small, I say relatively because it's not hundreds, it's thousands, but it's small relative to mass armies. Relatively small numbers of well-trained soldiers who were able to use them skillfully against large numbers of ill-trained Russian soldiers, conscripts in some part, poorly trained for the rest. The lesson for that for India seemed to be that there was reason to question the utility of a large conscript army which had low levels of training, and therefore it was worth considering at least shifting a component of the Indian army to a long service, more professional model, which was equipped with sophisticated weapons, but which required high levels of training to operate, not because the weapons themselves were complicated, but because using them required the quick and competent exchange of information among many participants. There had to be people who manned and operated the sensors. The sensors would identify the targets. The information had to be passed to analytical centers, which would prioritize targets. Targets had to be assigned to people with weapons. People with weapons had to deploy themselves adeptly at the tactical level. So this was a complex operation, which could only be well accomplished by people with long levels of training, not so much by conscript troops. The second phase of the war, however, suggested that we should not be so quick to think about moving entirely to a smaller professionalized army, because the second phase of the war is one in which the Russians shifted from rapid attempts to seize the capital city to a slow grinding effort to seize small parts of the eastern sections of Ukraine. This is a war of mass and firepower and slow advances, in which the availability of large numbers of soldiers, poorly trained, large numbers of unsophisticated artillery weapons, doesn't give the Russians a large advantage, but it does pose problems for the Ukrainians. When we met last time, Admiral Menon, with reason, was saying we might see a shift to World War II style of war. This is more like World War I styles of war, where massive artillery barrages are accompanied by very slow infantry withdrawals, much slower rates of advance than we saw the Soviet army achieve against the Nazis in the same part of the world, in the Ukraine, in the fall of 1944. It's useful to recall that the Soviets were able to move from eastern Ukraine to the center of Ukraine in about 3 or 4 months, which they clearly have not been able to do now. But the implications for India is that if in a war with China, India stalemates a Chinese attempt to achieve a rapid victory on the border, China might shift to a longer war strategy of attrition. And we are now trying to understand what that implies. It requires a steady flow of new conscripts who are trained. It requires a much larger stockpile of consumable military goods, fuel, food, as well as ammunition and spare parts. It requires a different training apparatus. We have seen that the Russians are not really capable of operating in a sophisticated way with the poorly trained troops that they have. And so we do face a problem like World War II, or like the United States faced in World War II. How can we rapidly train and field large numbers of soldiers to replace soldiers who are killed in a long grinding war in which casualties are heavy and the war's duration is measured in months, not in weeks? There are implications for the defense industrial base. Then there is a need to sustain these forces with material that is produced as the war goes on. So the second phase of the war at the level of organization and doctrine reminds us of the need to think about at least the requirements for fighting a long war. Everyone wants to fight short wars. China has the ability to fight a long war against India. And if India stalemates China and denies it the ability to fight a short war, China might shift over and fight a long war. And that would pose some rather different and equally difficult challenges to India. In the second phase of the war, we also saw the use of longer range precision strike weapons, some by Russia, less by Ukraine because the West was not supplying them until recently. That demonstrated what we knew already, that is in the modern age of sensors and precision strike weapons, fixed targets that were not camouflaged, were not concealed, were not relocatable, and not well defended, would be destroyed. The Ukrainian victory and their ability to force the Russians out of Snake Island is the most prominent example of that. Their strike on the Russian cruiser, the Moscow, was another. The implications for India is that it must take very seriously the ability of China to conduct deep precision strikes against the infrastructure, the fixed infrastructure of the Indian military. Protecting, concealing, diversifying that base structure is possible. It's expensive. It can be done. And there is the question then, what does India do if China strikes into Ukraine? China strikes into India the way Russia has struck into Ukraine, even though India has nuclear weapons. Will India strike into China to retaliate symmetrically if China strikes at Indian military bases inside India? China has nuclear weapons also. And then the final implication of the second phase of the war and the ability of precision strike weapons to operate against both mobile targets, aided by drones and satellites that can locate mobile targets, and operate against fixed targets, is that the Indian nuclear posture against China may not be invulnerable. The Agni 5 is coming online. It's going to be road mobile, but it is big. It is easy to find. There are not many of them. Road mobile ICBMs can be located by drones and can be struck rapidly by hypersonic missiles with precision and reliability. Indian fixed nuclear sites, most of which housing missiles that cannot reach the centers of power in China, are also vulnerable. And it will be a while before Indian nuclear submarines with ballistic missiles are fully operational and capable of reaching targets in eastern China. Think about this seriously, the implications of a long war with deep strikes, conventional strikes, means you have to think about the nuclear deterrence dimension. It means you have to think about maintaining nuclear deterrence in a shooting war, which is in the age of precision strike, in which non-nuclear weapons have the ability to neutralize nuclear weapons. I realize it's a large topic. I apologize for introducing a subject that was not given to me, but I was told that I could raise a subject that I thought was of interest. The second topic I rather less to say, but I think it is of importance, which is the quality of Russian equipment versus Western equipment. I'll make two remarks briefly. People are focusing on missiles and artillery and so forth, and that is important. I would emphasize the importance of communications equipment. The Russians were miserably equipped with a hodgepodge of all kinds of communications equipment that could not communicate securely with other pieces of Russian equipment. The Russians had Chinese equipment, they seized Ukrainian equipment, they had different flavors and varieties of Russian military communications. The Russians could not talk to each other. The United States began to learn these lessons after the Grenada operation in the 1980s, and there was a big push for jointness, in which people in the United States military tried to standardize on communications systems across branches of services and across services so that they could communicate with each other, so that they could cooperate and support each other in wartime. I do not know what the state of communications infrastructure within the Indian military is, but the lesson from the Ukrainian war with Russia is that the lack of standardized equipment in Russia, in the Russian military, was a major handicap, and the de facto adoption of standardized communications equipment supplied by the private sector in the West to Ukraine was a major advantage. The second thing, and I'll limit my remarks on equipment to this, is that the Russian industrial base was not capable of resupplying Russian forces with modern, up-to-date military technology. This was because stockpiles were depleted and because it could not produce more, at least in part because of Western sanctions. They could not attain the microchips and the other sophisticated Western imported equipment that they needed to fabricate Russian military equipment. The implications for India in the future is Russia as a long-term supplier of advanced military equipment ought not to be counted on. The sanctions are in place. They will have long-term effects. It's likely that the sanctions on militarily relevant equipment, components, will continue into the future. So Russia as a military industrial producer, and therefore a supplier to India, is something which should be regarded with a great deal of skepticism and caution because of the impact of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Finally, let me turn to the subject of the cyber war, the ones and zeros in the ether, as my friend Admiral Menard put it last time. I speculated in the last webcast that we had that the United States had assisted Ukraine in conducting cyber campaigns to take down some components of the Russian military secure communications system. It has since been publicly announced by the U.S. Cyber Command that the United States did engage in offensive cyber operations from the beginning of the war. Previously, this was a matter of debate and ambiguity. American doctrine did not call for offensive operations, but this has been officially confirmed. American cyber capabilities were very important in degrading Russian communications ability, enabling the Ukrainians, therefore, to track Russian locations by tracking their unsecure communications. And so the cyber war was important from the beginning. And as I mentioned last time, the private sector, Elon Musk's SpaceX and Starlink, was very important in supplying the Ukrainians with internet connectivity after the Russians took down the Viasat system on which the Ukrainians had been relying for internet satellite communications. So the lesson from the first phase of the war was that American support to Ukraine in the cyber area gave the Ukrainians an important advantage. I won't say it was decisive, but it contributed to the ability of the Ukrainians to delay and thwart the first phase of operations. That cyber war continues. It is not that the Russians are not trying cyber attacks. There are press accounts of dozens, in which the United States government states there has been dozens of Russian efforts to take down Ukrainian data connections. That has been defeated. And it's been defeated by a U.S. private sector partnership with the American intelligence community. This, in unclassified discussions, members of the American Big Four, Meta, formerly Facebook, Amazon, Alphabet, formerly Google, and Microsoft, have talked about their activities, such that Facebook has been alerted by the American intelligence community to Russian efforts to exploit social media, as Facebook has produced and fielded solutions which block these Russian efforts within a matter of 6 hours. Many Ukrainian computer systems operate on Microsoft software. Microsoft has been voluntarily in the middle of this being notified of and supplying patches to breaches in their cyber walls and cybersecurity. Amazon proudly announced that it had set up what they call a satisfaction center, a supply center in Poland to use the rapid delivery capabilities of Amazon to rapidly deliver humanitarian aid via Poland into Ukraine. So the American private sector, more on the model of the American private sector in World War II than the model of the recent difficulties of the private sector cooperation with the American government, the private sector has been voluntarily and enthusiastically supporting the American government's effort to help Ukraine in the cyber realm. And this has been enormously powerful. The lesson for India is that if there is a war which elicits the same kind of broad support from the Indian private sector that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has elicited from the American private sector, all of the resources, all of the talent, all of the wealth of the Indian cyber private sector will be brought to bear against the Chinese state sector. Now, who will have the advantage in this area, I don't know. But this is an issue which most likely would benefit from some planning ahead of time so that there are lines of communication between the Indian government and the Indian private sector so that people know who to work with. Just parenthetically, the relationship between Elon Musk's SpaceX and the US national security community did not begin with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. There were numerous contracts between the United States Space Command, Space Force, and other US government agencies and SpaceX beforehand, so that there were good lines of communication on those areas. In other areas, Google had been unwilling to the Defense Department before. My intuition would be that some pre-planning would facilitate this. I'll make one more remark and then I'll stop. A very interesting question, which I don't know how to evaluate, is what is the role of the Indian diaspora that is heavily involved in the cyber private sector outside of India. They are extremely talented, productive, and under some circumstances might be willing to support the Indian government in its efforts against a Chinese aggression. This would, if these are Indian Americans in the diaspora, the issue of American government views would have to be taken into account. But there is we as Americans benefit from, we are proud of the role of Indian Americans in America, but Indian and Americans may also have some views about how they wish to aid India in the event of aggression. Let me stop and turn the floor back over to the chair and to the other panelists. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Rosen. I think you've given us a lot of valuable commentary, a lot of technical information that I think will be of great benefit to our military planners. And so I think it's right that I should turn over to Admiral Menon. Firstly, whether and how much he agrees with Professor Rosen, and following the suggestions he has made, how much use can we make of his suggestions to improve our doctrine's force structures and our cyber capacity. On to you, Raja.
Thank you, Lalit. I'm grateful to the organizers, the Sondhi organization and the Kalinga organization, for allowing me to participate in this webinar. The subject of my short brief is to try and extrapolate the lessons of the Ukraine war in our own strategic milieu. Now, I realize that this is a military subject, and I'm only too aware of my predominantly naval background. But my hope is that extensive reading in military history might compensate for my lack of practical experience in having participated in a land war. What I would like to do is to try and start by placing the Ukraine war in the context of modern war. Modern war may said to have begun with, I think, the American Civil War and the introduction of the Gatling machine gun, which made it impossible to carry out a frontal infantry attack, as was the custom in those days. Now, European observers, including from Prussia, UK and France, were present at the American Civil War. But it's uncertain what lessons they took back to Europe, because we find that barely 35 years later, World War I broke out. And both the Allied and the German armies went in for frontal infantry attacks against barbed wire and machine gun fire, in the hope that artillery barrages would suppress both and enable the frontal infantry attacks to go through. Needless to say, the casualties were horrendous. There was public protest in both Germany and in England, and the general said that the answer was deemed to be even heavier artillery barrages. Note how the events are going exactly according to the Ukraine war. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, for instance, the British lost 60,000 soldiers in one forenoon, most of them bodies not recovered from the mud churned up by the artillery barrage. Then, in 1917, there appeared the tank at the Battle of Cambrai. The tank broke through the German lines and penetrated up to 5 miles and came to a stop, not knowing where to go therefrom. The British were stunned as much as the Germans. The British were stunned because no armored warfare doctrine had been written until that time. After World War I, both Major General Fuller and Captain Little Hart wrote that this would be the future nature of warfare, rapid maneuver by large tank columns, that they would go against an indirect approach against the main obstacle and bypass obstacles and built-up areas. Now, Fuller and Little Hart were not read extensively by the British. There was some prejudice because Little Hart rose only to the rank of a captain in the army. And Fuller was read after he became the chief instructor to the British Military Staff College. But Fuller had a problem in the sense that he had vague sympathetic leanings towards the Germans. But who read them very extensively were the Germans. And everyone is aware that the Germans then invented the doctrine of the Blitzkrieg. And the Blitzkrieg, which translates to lightning war, was demonstrated both in Western Europe and in Eastern Russia against Russia. The Blitzkrieg took just 40 days to overrun the whole of France, as compared to the 50 days now going on in the Ukraine war for the gain of a couple of kilometers. Now, the armored attack supported by aircraft became doctrine in most armies until it was added on by the Americans with their revolution in military affairs in Operation Desert Storm. The new RMA relied on what might be called omniscience. I'm sorry to use a big word, but it basically means seeing everything, like God is omniscient. That is, through satellite surveillance, mapping out the entire enemy territory and digitizing that information and passing that information to all users through wideband connectivity, which later on went on to become the civilian internet. This enabled the rapid delivery of missiles and aerial ordnance and speeded up what in military parlance is called the OODA loop, that is the observe, decision, and act loop. Since then, that predominantly the combination of the Blitzkrieg and the American RMA has been the basic army doctrine of all countries. Now, but where does Ukraine fit into this? This doctrine was upset by three factors. The first was the technological innovation of the advanced technology anti-tank weapon, which definitely puts the future of the tank into question. At the last count, the Russians had lost something slightly over 750 tanks. Second is a low-cost drone, which further questions the tank. And possibly, I foresee the introduction of the anti-personnel drone against infantry. The third is the effect of these two technological advances, which causes a static nature of future land warfare, which brings into question that famous joke of Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw. Manekshaw is supposed to have told the Navy and Air Force chiefs after the 71 war, my dears, you can win all the battles you like on land, on air, and in the sea. And you may even lose some battles at sea or in the air. But eventually, what is going to matter is the land war. But if the land war is going to go on like in Ukraine for 50 days, for the advance of 1 or 2 kilometers, the question arises is, can we rely on land warfare to be the decisive arm of the government? Of course, there is a fourth factor here, which is Putin's interference into military strategy, of which he does not perhaps know enough, and crippling the independence of his generals. For India, the results of a static war of attrition, particularly in the Himalayas, are revolutionary, because India has the largest standing army in the world, which absorbs 61% of the defense budget. Now, out of this budget, 82% of the army's budget is consumed by personnel, salaries, and pensions. Therefore, I would not be wrong in suggesting that the Indian army is a low-tech army. Secondly, the capital expenditure, the little capital expenditure that the army spends, is spent on the offensive component, which basically consists of 3 strike corps concentrated in the West, against a bankrupt Pakistan. Now, the strike corps, as you all know, are centered around tanks, whose future, I'm not saying is over, but is definitely uncertain. But fortunately, Pakistan does not have the money to upgrade the technology of its defenses and make irrelevant the strike corps. In any case, we are facing, according to some sources, a two-front war, which I think is calamitous. It probably means that our foreign policy has not been successful in protecting us against two fronts. The strategy of maintaining the bulk of our army's offensive capability against a degrading Pakistan definitely needs a rethink. We could perhaps start talks with Islamabad so that we can concentrate more against China. Now, for more than 50 years, there has been the constant criticism that we are making do without a national security strategy. I remember as a Commodore being in the defense planning staff and being tasked with my Air Force and Army colleagues to write a case to the government for the National Security Council and a National Security Advisor. So I'm fully aware of what is expected of these two gentlemen, or this organization and this gentleman. But I'm sorry to say that in the last 35 years, not one worthwhile paper has come out of the National Security Council to take note of the changing nature of warfare. Today, as China threatens United States hegemony and the rules governing the world, we are in a weak position against China, apart from the boundary question. As China grows, it is going to demand that we acknowledge Chinese hegemony in Asia. A rethink on our national security strategy will show that against constant Chinese pressure, we will need some kind of a counter-offensive strategy against Beijing. We must have something which the Chinese are apprehensive about. This counter-offensive strategy cannot be in the mountains. That is the tragedy. And I'll explain why. Because the Chinese have built a 6-lane highway from Arunachal Pradesh all along the Indian border up till Xinjiang. And they have reduced the size of their army to 975,000, which is 300,000 less than the Indian army. And yet, they are able to move altitude acclimatized troops laterally and overwhelm us at the point of conflict in any future war. The only weakness, so we need to think as to what China's weaknesses are. It is a huge continental power, it is economically prosperous, it spends a great deal on R&D, but the only weakness that I can see in China is its dependence on oil, 65% of which passes through the Indian Ocean. Now, taking note of this, we have made a good beginning with the Quad, but I think we have emasculated it by making it into a purely diplomatic grouping. We should militarize the Quad, initially through the intelligence sharing agreement, and create a Quad secretariat in Visakhapatnam or Port Blair to leverage the Quad's superior reconnaissance assets. All these 4 democratic countries have very strong maritime reconnaissance assets, and we should create information dominance over the Indo-Pacific. Remember that the American RMA is primarily based on info dominance. Once Beijing sees that info dominance in the Indo-Pacific is against them, they will be much more circumspect in their geopolitical aggression and on the border itself. What is more, converting this info-dominance into tactical superiority in the Indian Ocean is just a short step. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that we go in for a German-style U-boat war in the Indian Ocean and create an ecological disaster, but I'm suggesting that we sequester Chinese-bound traffic and anchor them in neutral territory, and then wait for the Chinese reaction and convert info dominance into a tactical strike capability. But so that instead of pushing more manpower, when we already have 300,000 men more than China to defend the Himalayan border, we hold out the threat of an oceanic counteroffensive to a Himalayan aggression. Lastly, at the present moment, the Ukraine war has devolved into an artillery duel, reminiscent of the First World War. The progress of the military conflict seems to have gone around in a big circle and ended up back as it was in 1914. Now, who knows? The tank may make a comeback, but currently India cannot afford to ignore the lessons of the Ukraine war. A decisive war on land, and that too under the nuclear umbrella, seems an unlikely option, particularly against Pakistan. Of course, war is not a good option at all under any circumstances. And to prevent war, we have to reduce the threat of a two-front war and demonstrate our capability in peacetime for an oceanic counteroffensive against China to preserve the peace. The Ukraine war has gone on for about 50 days. That's more than the time taken by the Germans in World War II to overrun the whole of France and Belgium. The 1967 Israeli war ran for 6 days and it changed the boundaries of 4 countries. It took the Indian army 12 days to liberate Bangladesh. So Ukraine shows that war has definitely changed, and we must stop and think to see how it affects us in South Asia. And if we don't do this, then I'm afraid we will not be learning the lessons of the Ukraine war and modifying our geopolitical and geostrategic perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Admiral Menon. Raja, you've given us a wealth of ideas. Many of them are really in the realm of military specialists. So we'll need to digest this information and perhaps have more meaningful discussion later on. But thank you for your valuable, very, very valuable comments on the state of preparedness of India to face future conflicts and future war situations. And now, as I had mentioned, we turn to Ambassador Mohan Kumar from military strategy and doctrine to foreign policy and strategic issues. Mohan, you have a lot of things on your plate which has been assigned to you, and look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, sir. Let me begin by thanking the ML Sondhi Institute and the Kalinga Foundation for this opportunity. Quite privileged and honored to be a regular panelist, as you rightly said in your opening remarks. I think I'll jump straight into the specific questions that you had posed, because we have had a wonderful tour d'horizon of all the military aspects. And in any case, that is not an area in which I hold any expertise. So I will not even try to add on to what the two panelists have said. You've given me a specific brief, so let me try and address that to the best of my ability. I'll begin by talking about strategic autonomy and strategic hedging, because I do believe a distinction needs to be made. I think if you look at the non-aligned period, when India was non-aligned and participated in the non-aligned movement with all the strategic objectives of that movement, what we were, if in effect, doing was accumulating strategic space or policy space. I believe that now the time has come for India to use that space. And using that space for me denotes strategic hedging, where you really have to use that space to hedge your bets. And I would like to give a mathematical example, if you will, because there has been a very, very interesting proposal by Admiral Menon that a Quad should be converted into a military alliance of sorts. We can have a discussion on this. I do not entirely share that perspective, but to give you a mathematical, shall we say, analogy, if you want to really grade strategic autonomy from 0 to 10, if you have a 0 or a 1, a low score, then you will need to be an ally of the United States and even an ally of Russia, if you like, whatever. It is a very clear illustration that you do not possess any meaningful capacity of deterrence. If you have a score of 10, then you don't need anybody. You are powerful in and of yourself, and you can go on to counter the threats. An ideal score of 10 would be a 10 trillion economy and India's military completely Atmanirbhar, so that we can take on Pakistan and China without reliance on any United States, UK, or even a Quad. I believe we are somewhere in the middle, despite our best efforts after 75 years. I don't want to talk about India's dependence on Russia, but an excellent article that I would recommend for everybody is an article by my good friend in France, Christophe Jaffrelot, who has written an Institut Montaigne about India's dependence on Russia. And he has broken it down with the army, the air force, and the navy. Broadly, I would say 90% dependence on army, 40% navy, and 70% air force. And he gives examples. So I have not seen a better article myself on the subject. So people may be interested in doing that. With this kind of a dependence on Russia, I believe, frankly, with a score of 5 or 6, in my model, if you like, we are left with no choice except to rely on Quad, to rely on the Franco-Indian relationship in the Indian Ocean, to rely on trilateral meetings, the ones that we have with Japan, Australia, India, for example. Sorry, France, Australia, India. So we are not left with any choice, which also explains why we participate in BRICS, for example. So your question, sir, as to whether we rely on strategic autonomy a little too much is because we don't have a score of 10. And if you want a score of 10, your economy has to be a 10 trillion economy with massive resources available to defend yourself without any reliance on anybody. That gives you full strategic autonomy. Plus, you have the resources to buy weapons from wherever you want instead of relying on Russia. Now, we are, I believe, nowhere near that situation. I would therefore say that we are doing the best possible job under the circumstances. There's no question in my mind that India has done exceedingly well in this conflict in Ukraine. You can either call it a trapeze act, but if you prefer the ethnic description, I would say a combination of Bharatanatyam and Kathak with contortions in between. I don't think anybody could have done anything better, frankly, under the circumstances. So I would give easily a 9 out of 10 for India's foreign policy in that sense. Strategic autonomy, I've been repeating this, I've been repeating myself, I've been crying hoarse. It's all about how big an economy you have, how much of resources you have at your disposal. Are we dealing with the China of the 1980s? No, we are not dealing with the China of 1962 either. We are dealing with the China because they are a $14-15 trillion economy. We are a 2.7, for God's sake. I mean, I really think there is absolutely no comparison. But for me, that is the definition of strategic autonomy, that you have the resources in order to have the luxury not to depend on anybody else. We simply don't have that situation today. Russia is diminishing. How to decouple from Russia? That was your second question. Regardless of a value judgment on how much Russia has stood by us in the past, how much Russia has been able to share technology with us when others were not willing to do, I think the fact is there is simply no question that is in India's own interest. We will have to drastically reduce our dependence on Russia. But to my mind, that does not mean you dramatically increase your dependence on France or United States or anybody else. I really think we should be trying to diversify our risk as much as possible. Plus, I would say Atmanirbhar. I think, sir, we have to recognize, I mean, there are enough military experts in this forum. The fact that we have to go into rifle manufacture with Russian help, which we have just awarded a big contract for the manufacture of rifles. We cannot manufacture an engine for our tanks, D-72 tanks. I mean, I think every Indian has a right to ask these questions. What were we doing for 75 years? I can understand nuclear submarines. I can understand S-400 missile systems. I cannot understand why we are going in for a huge contract for the manufacture of rifles. You mean to say we are not capable of manufacturing our own rifles in spite of having such a wide network of ordnance factories? So anyway, this may be water under the bridge, and I don't want to get emotional about it. But the fact is, this is where we are today. Even if you have the best goodwill for Russia, I don't think we can depend on Russia because Russia is going to change in many, many ways. We have seen what is happening there. We have seen what is happening to the equipment there. So there will have to be a paradigm shift away. I've had a number of conversations with retired army. I underline the word retired because I have not spoken to anybody serving. All of them tell me they will need a period of 5 years. But I would be grateful if we can start now and at least in 5 years' time say that we have diversified the risk, the supply risk. I think that is something that the military forces, the armed forces have to simply do it from day one. I think the time starts now, really. There is no time to lose. Doubts about the Quad, and I was referring to Admiral Menon's somewhat controversial proposal that the quadrilateral should become a military. I think Admiral Menon, with due respect, and this is just my view, we can talk about it, you would do that if India lost all strategic autonomy and we are desperate and we feel that we simply cannot manage the defense of the country vis-a-vis China and Pakistan. I hope we are not there yet. So I would not want us to do this at this stage. God forbid if there is something in 5-10 years and if we are desperate, what you say may be right. As I said, if you are reduced to zero strategic autonomy, like many other countries in the world, you will have to go into the strategic umbrella of somebody. After all, very self-respecting countries have done it. So we don't have to think we are the first country to do it. We will be the first country of this size to do it, but I hope we don't do it because I think the time is really to get our act together. I think the quadrilateral for me is best suited for the maritime sphere. Although there are some interesting things happening in the public health area in terms of producing vaccines and so on, I still think the real raison d'etre for the Quad is the maritime area. The Indo-Pacific maritime domain awareness is of huge importance for India. The Information Fusion Center in Gurgaon, where we have real-time information on what is happening in the maritime sphere, is of huge importance for us. Those are the kind of things that we should be looking to from the Quad. I would add one more thing for the Quad. I think it's the technology working group. But there, I think we are hobbled by our own internal weaknesses of decision making. But if we can quickly take a decision on digital commerce, then we have a real possibility of cooperating with the Quad countries to have a gold standard, at least in the area of technology, and especially digital commerce. And that is something that we should do without delay. But there, I think the problem lies within India, not outside. So that is something that if we can look to the Quad for public health, technology, but most importantly, everything in the maritime area, because that is where we are losing out. We simply have the only aircraft carrier we have is something which has been decommissioned from the Soviet Union. How pathetic is that? And we want to control the whole Indian Ocean area with that. So I think we really need the Quad for the maritime sphere. I would not go as far as to say that we must become an ally or a military alliance. And in any case, that may not happen because of AUKUS and other things. I'll now come to the last part of my talk, which is, you had asked me about the geo-economic impact, and that's what I had really prepared. And I must say, so the impact of and by the way, just a couple of comments on the military aspects of the Ukrainian war. Anybody who thinks now that military personnel and manpower is not important and that drones and robots can do the job, that the length of war can be short, that is, I think, a load of rubbish. I think the Ukraine war is back to the basics of the military conflict. Both my illustrious co-panelists have said it reminds them of World War I, and I completely agree. And that is something that we should keep in mind. There is an interesting proposition in the military sphere, which Admiral Menon and Professor Rosen will recall. It is that if you want to conquer a country and retain the country, you need a troop a ratio of 1 civilian and 50 soldiers. You need 50 soldiers for every single civilian. This is the biggest problem for Russia in Ukraine. Ukraine is a big country. It's not a small country. It's 44 million people, huge territory. And Russia is only 140 million population. Forget about standing armed forces. So without a ratio of 1:40, you could never have anyway contemplated the invasion of Ukraine. So I don't know what kind of planning went on, but this is something India will have to keep in mind, not vis-a-vis China, because we can never do that, but at least with regard to Pakistan, we must focus on what is the manpower that we really need. And that is critical, because this war has illustrated to me that you cannot overlook wars in the area of on land, because both China and Pakistan, we share a border. So I think that is something we must keep in mind. In terms of geoeconomics, sir, I think I want to say that the impact has been profound. The two kinds of broad impacts, if you like, one is on international trade and supply chains. The other is on commodity prices and inflation. So these are the two broad impacts. Now, under these headings, what has happened is, first, food inflation for developing countries like India, but also least developed countries, sensitive regions like Middle East, North Africa. Food inflation is key. India is in a somewhat fortunate situation with regard to this particular aspect, because we have public stocks of food grains, but many other countries don't. And that is the first. The second is energy inflation and shortage, which India is not immune. And frankly, the cost of fuel, the cost of petrol, which is kind of directly flown from the conflict in Ukraine, will impact India's poverty. And for me, that is the biggest problem. I mean, when I talked about a score of 10 out of 10 in strategic autonomy, I should add that not only should India be 10 trillion, I'm not dreaming of 15 or 20 trillion, but I think India has every potential to become a 10 trillion economy. But equally important, is dramatic reduction in the levels of poverty in India. So I must emphasize inclusive economic growth. We cannot afford to have 500 million people living in abject poverty, or what Niti Aayog calls multidimensional poverty. We simply can't afford that. So that is something that we need to do. And then the economic growth. I mean, one of the things for India reaching a score of 10, if you like, in strategic autonomy is that we grow at the rate of 8 to 9% for the next 10 years. But how will you grow at 8 to 9% if there are three shocks, external shocks? One is the cost of fuel, which will impact India's competitiveness. Second, India's own levels of poverty, which means the domestic market takes a hit. More people enter the poverty, so there is no demand, even within the country, or at least there is a shrinking of demand. Third, your exports will take a hit because external markets are also going to be very disturbed. In these conditions, I don't know if we will be able to do 8 to 9% over the next 10 years to reach a score of 10, my dream figure of 10 for strategic autonomy. Supply chain disruption, I want to talk a little bit about rare earths and things which directly flow from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Wheat, corn, and sunflower oil have been tremendously affected because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I need to say no more. Second, I would say potash. Both Russia and Ukraine are huge manufacturers of potash, which is used in fertilizers. And therefore, fertilizer prices and fertilizer availability has been a huge problem. This will affect, we've already seen the impact of this in Sri Lanka, but some other countries may also be badly affected. There is also supply chain disruption for neon, which is used in semiconductors, nickel, which is used in EV batteries, electronic vehicle batteries, and titanium and others which are used in mobile phones. So these have also been seriously disrupted. There is a shortage of chips. Everybody knows that. So these are really supply chain disruptions, and India, unfortunately, again, we do not enjoy a supply or a reliable supply of rare earths. China, for example, enjoys 60 to 70% in some of these rare earths, but India does not. Okay, so that is the social tension that could grow because of these issues is also important, especially in the Middle East, North African countries. So what does India do? The last part of my intervention, if you like. I think, as I said, there is no alternative except to grow at 8 to 9%. We need to be able to export because 40 to 50% of our GDP is foreign trade. How does India export? I think, which is why I attach considerable importance to our efforts to sign FTAs with EU, UK, GCC. We have done it with UAE, but we need to expand it to GCC. And of course, if we can do Australia, it's fine. So UK is important as well. But I would say EU, definitely. Second, the Indo-Pacific economic framework becomes important for India because it's the only thing that may ensure that we maintain our export share in the United States. You know, there is a feeling that the US, we are doing well, EU, we are doing well. Why should we accept environmental and labor standards? I want to contest that. I want to say that without environmental and labor standards, India's exports will be completely shut out from these markets. It's a matter of time because there is a move in these countries to take these standards seriously, which is why the Indo-Pacific economic framework talks of high quality labor and environment standards. And I think India will be well advised to really try to set its house in order, even under pressure from FTAs and IPEF, because by ourselves, we are finding it difficult to do anything. We have tried the eminently sensible farm bills, and we all know what happened to those. So politics intervenes. It prevents deep economic reforms that India has to undertake. So it's better we do it in order to qualify for these agreements. And that seems, at least from my perspective, that's the only hope. I think FDI, I cannot underestimate the importance of FDI from Quad countries. You know, the importance of Quad is also that we leverage our membership in the Quad to tell them that we are happy to do things in climate change. We are happy to do things in the area of 5G. We are happy not to depend on China or Huawei, but this has a price. It means that US and EU must help us out. They cannot just tell us don't go for Huawei and we will not do anything for you. So I think this is a negotiation that needs to be conducted by India, that if we are decoupling from China in the area of technology, particularly we have banned TikTok, we have said no to Huawei, we are now having issues with mobile phone manufacturers in India. You saw what is happening to Vivo. FDI restrictions continue with China and so on, which means that we need alternative, which is why the investment agreement that India is negotiating with European Union becomes critical. I really think that should be a gold standard investment agreement, which we can then apply to United States and others. So I would stop here perhaps and say that we've done well. That is point number one. To recapitulate, I don't think we could have done better in terms of our stance and posture and position on the Ukraine conflict. Unfortunately, the war in Ukraine has set us back by 2 years, I believe. You know, we were on the cusp before the pandemic in terms of economic growth, in terms of getting things right. Unfortunately, at least 2 years, perhaps more, because more people have now entered the poverty, or they've started living below the poverty line. We need to really, therefore, buckle up when it comes to economic growth and internal economic growth and FDI, for foreign direct investment. Tough decisions need to be made on digital commerce, environment, and labor. And that is something that wants to do it, that we have to do so. And finally, let's also not forget that BRI, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, is also facing considerable headwinds. And that is something that we must exploit. If we can have, we missed the bus on global value chains. The question is, can we get on to resilient supply chains, which is now seen as not as a complete substitute, but perhaps as a complement to some global value chains, because just-in-time manufacturing is out and just-in-case manufacturing is in. I think we need to look once again at taking the initiative with regard to FDI, resilient supply chains, and as I said, some of the new areas in digital commerce, environment, and labor standards. Sir, thank you very much. I'll stop here and hope to have a discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohan. That was very comprehensive and raised a lot of issues. Now, friends, we have time for discussion amongst the panelists. And we thought this would be useful because the panelists themselves can comment on the presentations made by the co-panelists. And maybe there are issues that they can raise, discuss, and provide us with the benefit of the expertise. So let me go in the same serial order. Let me ask Professor Rosen if he would like to comment on what Raja and Mohan have said, and whether you would like to add to your comments after you've heard them. Professor Rosen.
Thank you, Ambassador Mansingh. First, let me make sure that I correct what I may have misstated. It seems I referred to the Indian Army as a conscript army. If I said that, that obviously is incorrect. I was referring to the Indian Army as Admiral Menon did, as a mass low-tech army, and the contrast was between the two. I fully agree with Admiral Menon's observation that it is difficult to see how India can achieve a decisive military advantage in the event of a war with China on the Himalayan frontier, and therefore India may wish to seek strategic leverage by operations against Chinese sea lines of communication. I think that is very much worth exploring. And I think there are ways that India can do this without becoming dependent on AUKUS or dependent on the United States. There are a number of countries which supply or build the kinds of submarine forces that India might well want to have to execute the interdiction campaign that Admiral Menon referred to. France, but also Japan and South Korea. I defer to Admiral Menon on the issue of whether India needs nuclear submarines. Australia needs nuclear submarines because Australia is far away from where the naval battles will be fought, and nuclear power is very useful for transiting large distances at high speeds. Indian submarines will be operating in the Indian Ocean. And so lithium ion battery submarines, as are currently being produced in Japan and South Korea, would be the kind of long endurance local submarines that India might find useful to have in deterring Chinese aggression. So I fundamentally agree with Admiral Menon on the need for an Indian naval sword, but I agree with Ambassador Kumar. China, there's a saying in the American military, when making plans, you must concede that the enemy has a vote. You don't make plans on the basis of what you want to do. You have to make plans on the basis of what your adversary will do. China will use its leverage on the Indian land frontier to put pressure on India, and therefore developing a sustainable posture for India against China in the event that China wants to make life miserable for India is alas necessary. So I agree again with Ambassador Kumar's injunction, not to disregard high technology, but also not to disregard the manpower requirements of a long war. Finally, one last comment. I am not an economist. I am not a developmental economist, but I do have questions about whether the rates of GDP growth that are proposed and which are central to Ambassador Kumar's strategy will be achieved. And therefore, it seems to me reasonable to ask, what would India do if those rates of economic growth cannot be achieved? And that does seem to imply closer relationships with other strategic partners to make sure that China cannot use its massive economic preponderance to coerce India. And I think India would guard against becoming militarily dependent on one country like the United States. India has had multiple unhappy experiences with the United States with regard to the supply of military goods, by diversifying its supplies of critical military components, which in the modern industrial environment is possible. So a diversified military industrial portfolio, I think, is a reasonable hedge against the possibility that India may not achieve the $10 billion GDP that we would all like to see India have, but on past experience may be difficult to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rosen. Raja, a lot of military issues have been raised.
Yeah, I'd like to clarify what I said about militarizing the Quad. I have no idea that we should form an alliance like NATO. What I'm suggesting is something a little more subtle, in the sense that what the greatest asset of the 4 Quad countries today is maritime reconnaissance aircraft. And maritime reconnaissance aircraft carry out reconnaissance in peacetime. And there is an intelligence sharing agreement whereby they can pass the information that they pick up to the other countries. And thereby it is possible in peacetime, without an alliance, to maintain a plot of Chinese surface vessel movements in the Indo-Pacific in peacetime without an alliance. Now, converting that alliance into the delivery of ordnance is up to any single member of the Quad. And what I'm suggesting is that we don't bring the Americans, the Japanese, and the Australians into our quarrel with China and the Indian Ocean, but we definitely leverage the Quad to carry out an oceanic counteroffensive. Now, this is quite different from an alliance. So I don't think that we should misunderstand my suggestion of militarizing the Quad into an alliance. The second point I'd like to mention is, yes, there are periods when our foreign policy has been extremely dexterous and successful. But to end up with two hostile enemies and to have to spend our military budget on defending against two countries does not speak of a successful foreign policy. Pakistan is going bankrupt. And to have all the capital money of the army budget concentrated against a degrading, bankrupt Pakistan is bad policy. And there are people in this country who talk about two front wars. Now, their interests are very minor. It probably means for them that there'll be more vacancies for generals. But that's not a foreign policy. In fact, I have a feeling, it may be a personal feeling, that most professional diplomats are quite keen to begin rapprochement and talks with the Pakistanis once again. Can Pakistan attack us when they can't pay their bills? So I don't think we should get into a situation where we have to defend ourselves against two enemies. That's all I have to say.
Mohan, there was a issue raised by Professor Rosen on the need for nuclear submarines. Would you rather comment on that?
Sir, exactly what was the question? Sorry, on nuclear submarines?
On whether India actually needs nuclear submarines, considering the area of operation of the Indian Navy. You being a naval expert, you kindly comment on that.
You're asking Admiral Menon or me, sir?
I'm asking Admiral Menon.
Yeah, thank
you.
Oh,
yes. Yeah, I can definitely answer that.
Yeah.
You know, info-dominance is one thing. I think that the creation of info-dominance will by itself act as a deterrent to China. But if it does not, then moving one step forward from info-dominance to the delivery of ordnance should be a very short step. In fact, I have written an extensive paper on this, which I don't want to bring into this discussion. But the tankers that we sequester of China-bound traffic should act as the bait for a Chinese attempt to force the Malacca Straits, in which case we create a successful American-style battle space at the exit to the Malacca Straits. In a scenario like that, nuclear submarines have indeed a great utility. In fact, the captains of the Chinese aircraft carriers should have sleepless nights worrying about the Indian nuclear submarine. And that's what they are for. and they're going in for 5 aircraft carriers and probably nuclear aircraft carriers. We should make the Chinese maritime strategy, the owners of the Chinese maritime strategy, uneasy and have, as I said, sleepless nights with nuclear submarines.
Well, I don't want to hog the discussion, but an interesting point here. If nuclear submarines are that important for us strategically, then should we not be sounding the Americans about giving us the technology and proposing co-development? Should we not asking the French to give us the technology that they possess? Are we really doing anything serious about building nuclear submarines, except that you're hoping the Russians will give us a couple of their submarines on lease?
I must say that a great deal of attempts have been made by retired naval officers, unfortunately, in their contacts with the members of the Hill and American think tankers to press for the idea of a transfer of nuclear submarine technology. But the answer has always been, you can have anything, but nuclear submarine technology is something that the US Navy holds on to very guardedly. And this is a very unfortunate state of affairs. And I feel instinctively that in our attempts to keep the Quad as a diplomatic grouping, the Americans have probably chosen the Australians above us in the grant of nuclear submarine technology. I mean, they know very well that we can create much more mayhem against the Chinese with nuclear submarines than the Australians can. The Australians need to send their submarines a long way before they can create any damage to the Chinese. But I think that this issue is linked. The reason why American submarine technology is so important is because they use 95% enriched uranium. And that reactor core lasts for the life of the entire submarine. So the Russians have just made one submarine with 95% enriched uranium, the Yasen class. If we open negotiations with the Russians on the Yasen class, then we can continue business as usual. Russians are our suppliers, Russians are our dependable allies, get the Yasen class, and everything is happy. But if the Yasen is not going to be available, then American submarine technology would be critical in the formation of an effective maritime strategy.
Okay, let me ask Mohan. Mohan, you have close and intimate knowledge of French cooperation, military cooperation with India. Would the French be reluctant to extend technology cooperation to India, as I understood Raja Menon to be suggesting, that it's not so easy to get the technology, there's reluctance from the suppliers. But if he made an effort, surely France with its technology, I think could be persuaded to have a joint venture with us. I'm sure if we tried hard enough, even the Americans would be happy to give that technology, provided we give them assurances of partnership, which at the moment, as the Americans probably put it, has been a little shaky, but I leave it to you. What is your perspective on this, on nuclear subs?
So my view, I'm no expert, but to the extent I was ambassador there and I was DCM there, my diplomatic sense is that it will require enormous efforts on our part to convince the French to part with this technology. I think it can be done. I don't think it's impossible, but it is difficult. It will require sustained negotiations and it will require quid pro quo. A lot of things in other areas that we will have to then be willing to give them. I can only think of some areas, but there are, I think, a whole lot of things that France and India do together, and those will come into play. It will also mean that we may have to depend even more on France for some of the things for which we already depend on them. So to some extent, that question is an interesting one because it takes you away a little bit from Atmanirbhar. But that's the dilemma that India is going to have. Because these are not single time purchases when you just say it is one transaction, I pay for it and it's all over and done with. One thing leads to another, and there is also already a web of obligations on both sides and so on. That's the way it works to the extent I've seen it. Sir, before, can I proceed to some of the other points which have been addressed to me, or do you want to finish?
Just one, Raja raised his hand. Maybe he wants to make a quick comment and then we can proceed.
Sure.
Yeah, I agree with Mohan. There's got to be some kind of a quid pro quo. I think that what we have to try and sell to the French is the idea of France. France as a great power. France in world affairs. France as a player in the Indo-Pacific. I think that's what we've got to sell. I don't think we should go on to commodities. I think we should give the idea, as de Gaulle would have said, La France. And that can be achieved by giving nuclear submarines to India and balancing the issues in the Pacific. I think that's the way to go. Of course, I'm not a diplomat, but that's what appeals to me.
Okay, Mohan, a quick comment. Are we looking at de Gaulle or are we looking at Macron?
No, I think he has a point, but I think you need to really substantially sit down and negotiate with them. The French, I can only reveal this much, that the French were quite annoyed at the length and the intensity of the negotiations on Rafale. So we are looking at two countries, neither of which have a reputation of being easy negotiators. So that's there as well. There is a lot of comfort level in terms of at the top level, at the political level. But I think at the negotiating level, there were quite a few issues which cropped up during the Rafale negotiation. So there will have to be a clear brief, a political will, and a negotiator who is maybe a little bit divorced, if I may, from the armed forces and not the traditional structures of negotiations that we have, which take forever. Sir, three issues have been addressed to me. If you allow me very quick.
Sure.
One is Admiral Menon, who says our foreign policy is a bit of a failure. As an ex-foreign service officer, I cannot let that comment pass. I think two things are worthy of note. With China, we took the view that there is enough space in Asia for two powers, that is India and China. And we said $100 billion trade will help us to avoid conflicts. I believe both these theories have been busted by the Chinese in Ladakh. They don't give a damn about place for India. They say we are the only ones who matter. Secondly, the $100 billion is turned out to be zero for them. They don't give a damn. You can do what you want with your TikTok and Huawei. They do what they want in Ladakh. That's number one. Number two, with regard to Pakistan, I believe we have done exactly to Pakistan what the United States did to the erstwhile Soviet Union, which is it weakened them economically and it made the Soviet Union spend so much on their arms and acquisition of weapons that the Soviet Union became bankrupt. I believe it is to the credit of India's policy that today Pakistan faces that same situation which was faced by the erstwhile Soviet Union. And hence, I think you have to admit, at least with regard to Pakistan, our policy has been a relative success. Today, I do not believe Pakistan in and of itself constitutes a threat to India. Second, on Professor Rosen's very valid point, what if India does not grow at 8 to 9%? This is what you asked me, Professor Rosen, and I completely agree that it is a valid question. I think very simply, in accordance with my mathematical model, we go back to 0 strategic autonomy or 2 strategic autonomy. What else can I say? I am linking the space for strategic maneuver directly to the rate of economic growth, the resources which are available, and our ability to bring down the rate of poverty in India. If we don't do that, and it's a fair point, who knows? I mean, I'm not in a position to say we will grow 8 to 9% for the next 10 years. If we don't, I believe our space for maneuver will become even more constricted, and we will rely more and more on external powers. That's the only answer I can give. There is a gentleman by the name of Mr. Venkat Siddhartha who has raised some valid points on my intervention. One is a mistake that I made. I think it is not titanium which is used in phones, but lithium. I'm sorry, lithium and batteries is what I meant. So sorry for that. Second, and a more interesting point that he has made is that he says, if you can't do everything yourself, consensus on economic reforms, you want foreigners to put pressure on India and you will then reform. He makes it sound as though India is the first country which is doing it. I wish to ask him, did you not do it in 1991? Did you not do it when you joined the WTO and accepted the TRIPS agreement? Did China not do it when they joined the WTO? There's so much pain was inflicted on China when China joined the WTO. Countries have to face pain. They have to face pressure. It's only then that you can reform. If you keep saying, I'm going to be completely Atmanirbhar, and you say autarky, and I will not face pressure from anywhere, then you will not be linked to the external world. And that is a choice you have to make, frankly. And for me, the 1991, there was no consensus, no attempt at consulting anybody for economic reforms in India. We just went ahead and did it. Like the Nike slogan, just do it. That's what we did. And I'm suggesting, after the failure of the farm bills in India, I don't think there is appetite for political consensus in India for reforms. It's become impossible. You can argue till the cows come home why this has happened, but the fact is it has become impossible to develop a political consensus. This is despite a party which has a thumping majority in the parliament. If that is the situation, I don't see a problem in entering into international agreements on the basis of quid pro quo. So when I am saying we should accept environmental and labor standards, I am not telling Mr. Venkat that we should get nothing in return. Your exports will be protected. You will get technology. You will get transition period. You will get financial assistance. You will get technical assistance. If you want to turn down all that and say, sorry, I will live with my child labor. I will live with pollution in Delhi. I will live with my dirty industries. The choice is yours. That's what I meant to say. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, Mohan, I have a question, which I think others may be interested in. If our foreign policy has been successful, obviously we should continue what we have been doing, quite rightly. But doubts have also been raised about strategic autonomy being defined in pretty narrow terms, which would imply to our partners, we care for our interests, not yours. Does India need a modification of that to make it strategic autonomy plus to make it acceptable to our strategic partners? Because this seems to be cropping up every time there is a crisis. And there have been many public spats with our strategic partners, even on the issue of Ukraine. So what are your thoughts on that?
Sir, my view is that there has been a twin reaction to India's position. One, by the Western countries in the main. One has been a public reaction, and the other has been a private reaction. I have reasons to believe that in private, most of our Western partners have told us we fully understand and appreciate where India is coming from on the issue of Ukraine. Publicly, the politicians and even senior officials of the Western countries are under some pressure to put India on the mat, because there is pressure from their populations saying that why is the world's largest democracy not standing by a small country which has been invaded? And that is a relevant question. You cannot dismiss that question saying, no, 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 this is all because of NATO's provocation. This is all because of 20, 30 years. Nobody's going to buy that. The fact is, if you look at current events, Russia is clearly at fault. There is a reason why Russia did what I did. I'm not getting into that. There is a very good reason. But I don't think the public has an appetite to go so far into history and try and understand NATO's enlargement and so on. So publicly, what you are seeing in the newspapers and what you are hearing from our Western friends is, I think, a little bit different. I'm not saying it's completely different. In private, my sense is we have been able to convince them that, listen, we are not going to bust your sanctions regime. That's the first point we have made in private. It is your regime. We are not busting it. If we are buying oil, we are saying others are buying oil as well. You've not prevented the EU from doing it. Why would you impose on India a stricter rule than a transatlantic ally? Secondly, I do believe they know, and maybe we have given an assurance, but that I'm not able to confirm, the secular trend is going to be a diminution of our dependence on Russia. I think they know it. The Western partners know it. I dare say Russia knows it. And I think everybody who is involved in this game knows it. Whether it is 5 years, 7 years, I don't know. But I don't think it is going to be the same level of dependence. It could well be Atmanirbhar, which would be my preferred option, by the way. But that is something all our partners know. Lastly, I think the Western countries know that while Russia is the immediate problem and the threat, there is a long-term threat, which is China. And I do not seriously believe that a lot can be done without India's active help in this area. I think the Western countries know it. We of course need that help because of my contention that our strategic autonomy score is 5. I hope it becomes 10. But as long as we are hovering around 5 and 6, we need the Western countries. I think more importantly, the Western countries, now that even NATO has described China as a challenge, I do not see how NATO or the Western countries can successfully meet the China challenge without India. That would be my submission to you.
Sure. I think we have to wind up this segment on the discussions amongst the panelists. So let me ask you if you have any more final comments amongst the co-panelists on the issues which have been raised. Should I go in serial order? Professor Rosen first.
Thank you. I would not presume to challenge Admiral Menon, a former submarine commander, on the issue of what submarine force is most appropriate for India. All I would say is that the best should not become the enemy of the good. Nuclear submarines may be the best capability for India, but the political difficulties are large. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands are only 1,000 nautical miles from the Straits of Malacca. And so it's not inconceivable that non-nuclear submarines, while not nearly as good as nuclear submarines, could still give the Chinese aircraft carrier commanders the kinds of nightmares that Admiral Menon and I wished them to have. The only other observation I have for Ambassador Kumar is, not for now, but for the future, an Indian economy which does not grow as rapidly as you wish will have less autonomy. Sketching out what that means in practice. What does a diminished strategic autonomy for India turn into in terms of defense and foreign policies? I think needs further exploration, because I think it is the dominant scenario going forward. And we can avoid future friction between our countries if the United States understands what India thinks to be appropriate for the strategic autonomy that it actually has, rather than the strategic autonomy we would wish it to have. But I don't want to delay the conversation further. Thank you so much.
One, a quick comment, if you wish.
No, sir, if I understood Professor Rosen rightly, if we have lesser strategic autonomy because of the declining rates of growth or rates of growth which are less than optimal, I dare say our dependence on United States and the Western allies will increase exponentially, with much lesser room for maneuver for India and much greater leverage for them. What implications this will have, I'm unable to kind of look into the future, because, you know, countries have to decide at the end of the day, the degree of pain that India will be able to absorb will also determine that leverage. Maybe Mr. Venkat Siddhartha's scenario may come true. That is, we will remain an autarkic country with no improvement in environment standards, no improvement in labor standards, no integration with the global economy. That is a possibility. After all, we were that before 91. Before 91, India was like that. And so it is not something you can forecast accurately, because there are other variables. One of the main variables I find that, for example, the Russian population's ability to take or accept economic sacrifice is way more than any other country, including India, if you don't mind my saying it, frankly. It is amazing how the population in Russia is able to accept deprivation and sacrifice. That is also a factor in a country's foreign policy, whether we like it or not. It may not be the only factor, but it is a factor. And so it's hard to contemplate exactly, but I think for a start, it will lead to India really depending on external powers. My point is, and submission is, even that is not an ideal scenario for United States or West, because I believe a strong India to counter China is in their interest, is what I'm saying. So I don't think even a high level of dependence by India on these countries is in their interest. But that's my point of view. Thank you.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I think we need to close this, unless Raja, you accept the difference of opinion on nuclear subs and leave it at that. Let the experts reach their conclusions. Or do you want to have the last word in this?
No, that's fine.
It's okay.
That's fine. The thing about a nuclear submarine is its frightening mobility. It can, in a period of 1 week, it can cover critical targets in the entire Arabian Sea. Whereas when it comes to an actual conflict, it may be only slightly better than a conventional submarine. But this conventional submarine has no mobility. It's like a floating minefield.
Okay, I suggest you have a bilateral discussion with Professor Rosen and report to us on the conclusions.
Sir, if you allow me just one point.
Yeah.
Just one last point, sir. I'll take half a minute with your permission.
Sure.
Does this not mean that a no first use doctrine of India also needs to be reviewed, is something that I put on the table?
Oh God, that's
well, in the light of what has happened in Ukraine. I mean,
that has taken
everybody
years.
Everybody in Ukraine feels that they should have kept the nuclear weapons.
Okay, that has led to years of discussions at think tank levels. Let's not raise that here.
I will withdraw that comment. Thank you.
Okay. I think we have reached the end of this segment of discussions amongst the panelists, and we are running late. I will now seek the help of Vivekananda, because we are supposed to leave time for Q&A. So if there are questions that have been raised, Vivekananda, could you recite them, give a list of the questions, and let the panelists...
Sir, Ambassador Surendra Kumar initially raised some, I think, slightly political questions about the suffering in Ukraine, and he's asking like an emotional question whether the rhetoric of world leaders is anything other than saving face. And his second question is, let's see, sort of referring to the Quad meeting and that how Russia's aggression wasn't condemned, and then sort of raising the point that in future, if China commits aggression against India, will it be all right for India if none condemns China's aggression? So slightly political questions. I don't know if maybe you yourself would like to answer that, Ambassador Mansingh.
No, I think let's stick to the questions raised among the panelists and not go outside that. Is Surendra Kumar there? Would he like to ask the question himself very briefly?
Ambassador Surendra
Kumar
probably left by now. Yes, I think he was there initially. Now it's not there.
Okay. Well, Mohan, would you like to have a shot at that?
No, sir, nothing so far. Sir, what was the precise point? I'm sorry, I was looking at my phone. I apologize.
The rhetoric of world leaders was not very helpful for Ukraine. I mean, that's what I understood.
Sir, I think I would not say that nothing has happened, because I think a lot of military aid has gone to Ukraine. A lot of support has gone to Ukraine, but yes, it has not been unanimous. I think you've also had a view which has been radically different. If you take Henry Kissinger and John Mearsheimer, and Professor Rosen would know that, there has been a division of view even in the United States among stalwarts on exactly what the Ukraine's issue is all about. So given that, my sense is billions of dollars of aid in weapons and otherwise has gone to Ukraine. But you are dealing with the next superpower, which is sitting on the largest nuclear warheads in the world, and which has got a standing army which is much larger than Ukraine, and which already had a foothold in parts of Ukraine. So, and they have recalibrated the military objectives to just dominate Donbass. My sense is Donbass is practically gone. The Luhansk province is gone, and the Donetsk province, I may be pronouncing it badly, forgive me. The Donetsk province has got only very few cities now left. So I believe we are looking at a de facto division of Ukraine, which is something a lot of people forecast right at the beginning. This, I don't think, can be reversed by even NATO. It can't. So the question really now is two scenarios: whether you allow this war to linger and become a cancer in the middle of Europe, or you sit down and talk and look at a reasonable division. Frankly, I hate to be brutal about this, but frankly, the Ukrainians don't seem to be ready, because they are still talking about recovering territory which they have lost. So I think you are looking at a war of attrition, and until that happens, you know, in today's circumstances, if you don't have unanimity in the Security Council, which you don't because Russia is an actor, you are not going to get unanimity in the General Assembly. If you can't get unanimity even among the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, how do we expect unanimity among the General Assembly? So I think, therefore, the question as to nobody has gone to the aid of Ukraine is wrong. To expect everybody to go to the aid of Ukraine is unrealistic. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, I'm back to you, Vivekananda. Are there any other questions?
One question possibly again for Ambassador Kumar. Dr. Giri is saying that how do we build our GDP without moving close to G7 countries minus China? So sort of possibly not satisfied with your discussion on FTAs, and do we need to do more than that?
No, I don't disagree with the question at all. I sincerely believe that without the Western markets, without Western technology, because Chinese technology is unacceptable for a variety of reasons, I will not get into it. 3 things, frankly, in response to this point. One, our export destination is EU and the United States. It is not to the east of India. That is point number 1. Point number 2, the emerging technology and state-of-the-art technology is in the West. Third, I do believe sincerely, immigration also is to the West. Do all your youth want to go to China and settle down? Even your existing students are not able to go back to China. How many ASEAN countries are going to allow immigration from India? So your fundamental interest is to the West. I completely agree. And without that, I do not believe we can grow at 8 to 9%. That also I agree. If that is the contention of Dr. Giri, I completely agree. I'm sorry if I gave a different picture, but this is the correct picture, which is why we are doing FTAs with EU, which is why we are part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement, which is why we are doing an FTA with UK, which is why we are doing an FTA even with GCC, which is also to the west of India. Action is all to the west of India is what I'm saying. Thank you.
Okay.
So we've essentially covered all the questions. So
all right. I think we've had a very good discussion. I expected it to be very high level, which I'm happy it was. There are many residual issues which can't be resolved in this session, and maybe later on we can do it. So I want to thank all the panelists for their patience, for the depth of their knowledge, and for giving us the benefit of their expertise. But now, formal vote of thanks. For that, I will request Dr. Shivaji Sondhi. Is he? Shivaji, are you there?
yes, he's there.
Yes, there. Would you kindly give the vote of thanks?
I will. I assume you can all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So first of all, Ambassador Mansingh, I would like to thank you for conceptualizing this second round of discussion, and for both seeking to formulate some precise questions, and for astutely steering the discussion, which goes to show that a lifetime in diplomacy has many virtues even long after you've left the service. And then, of course, our panelists, whom I should thank again, Professor Rosen for joining us a second time, Professor Admiral Menon for this time providing a naval counterpart to Professor Rosen's military understanding, and to Ambassador Mohan Kumar for, as usual, everybody else gets the Arabian Sea, and he typically gets the Pacific Ocean of remaining issues, which covers everything else except military issues, and which he did with his customary flair. And of course, on behalf of the organizers, we are delighted that he accepts our invitations to join us as often as he does. And with that, as always, I need to thank my brother for carrying 95% of the burden of organizing these meetings, and leaving me with not much to do except to show up and deliver the vote of thanks, which I hope I've done to everybody's standards.
Well, thank you, Shivaji, for your vote of thanks. And I agree with you. I think we need to give a special vote of thanks to Vivekananda.
Absolutely.
Being the very spirit behind these discussions.
Thank you, sir.
And I hope you will have the patience to continue
I
in
will,
the future also.
Okay.
Will that, do we
Yeah.
bring this discussion to a close?
Yes, we should close
Well,
now, sir.
thank
And
you.
I hope to release a recording to all the panelists and everyone else soon, so we
Okay.
can go over the material more closely later.
So thanks again to all the panelists and participants. And hopefully we will meet again and continue the unfinished part of our discussions. Thank you.
Thank
Till
you.
we meet again.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Lalit.